The prominent Jewish rabbis during the first century did their level best to count up all the commandments in what we would now call the Old Testament. The result of their tedious tabulation was that there were 613 commands in the Hebrew Scriptures, 248 positive commands, you shalls, corresponding to the number of parts of the human body as understood at the time, and 365 negative commands, you shall nots, corresponding to the number of days in a year. From that total number of commandments, the rabbis would in turn summarize them with the so-called 10 Commandments corresponding to the number of fingers on human hands. In the conversation with the religious authorities in our gospel reading today, Jesus boils down the 613 and then 10 to two basic commandments that hinge together side by side. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The greatest commandment is not one command but two. Love of God and love of neighbor cannot be separated. It's a good catechetical lesson for our confirmands this morning. Now, what does this mean in the words of Martin Luther? First of all, love of God without love of neighbor spells cop-out. We cannot love God as an abstraction. We cannot love God as a moral principle separated from common, down-to-earth human existence. If the closest thing to the face of God we know and see and recognize in our daily walk is our neighbor, then how can we love God without loving that neighbor? This is the basic meaning of the Christian life. God makes God's self available to be loved through Jesus Christ in the person and need of the neighbor. Love of God without love of neighbor is an unlocated or dislocated love. Love needs concrete direction. Love is real. Love is relational. The writer of 1 John sums up our need to keep love of God inseparable from love of neighbor. Those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. Love of God without love of neighbor spells cop-out. On the other hand, love of neighbor without love of God spells burnout. There is a transcendent sense in which the command to love God remains first. Oh yes, there are plenty of altruists and humanists and even atheists in our world who do a tremendous amount of good. But when human beings become the total reference point, we lose the depth of hope needed to love the neighbors over the long haul. Our love, even for fellow human beings, becomes shallower as we are driven more by the daily demands of life than by the love of God that flows through us. We are merely the conduits for divine love to flow to the neighbor, but we often get confused and think we are the well, source, spring, and origin of love. We need to be reminded that for God's sake, we love God. For God's sake, we love our neighbor. And the highest form of neighbor love is to share one's faith in God so that the neighbor also develops a relationship with God. Again, love of neighbor love ourselves because God first loved us. How do we know deep down that God first loved us? Because God the Father gave His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, who lived in communion with neighbors and sinners, died on a cross, and rose again to give us all the strength to love. Look to Christ. Look into the face of Christ. Look into the cross of Christ, and you will look into the strength to love God and love neighbor. Oh, again, 1 John offers strategic commentary on this point. In this is love, not that we love God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the atoning sacrifice of our sin. Dearly beloved, fellow confirmands, you desire to put into a nutshell the will of God for your life? The two great commandments get to the heart of the matter. You shall love the Lord your God with your whole being. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love of God without love of neighbor spells cop-out. Love of neighbor without love of God spells burnout. But even with the will of God, we need the wherewithal from God. Two commandments need the gospel, the good news. Jesus Christ came down deep into your journey to be your strength to love both God and neighbor. As divine and human, Christ Jesus becomes in fact both your God and your neighbor in disguise. Christ Jesus comes to be your life